When Marvel Studios made its cinematic universe, it made something really interesting. A bunch of different movies with their own storylines that were all interconnected together. Some video game developers have attempted this as well, but you'd be hard-pressed to find a series that has done it as well as the Legend of Heroes franchise by Falcom. It took a long time for many of these games to start coming to the West, but you've got Ao no Kiseki, Trails in the Sky, and finally Trails of Cold Steel. All of these little sub-series have their own sequential storyline that stands on its own, but as you go further in each series, you'll find that they're all interconnected with each other. PlayStation Vita players should be very familiar with the Cold Steel series, as its first two entries released on the Vita alongside the PS3 and later PS4. But handheld players seemed to miss out on the rest of the series when Cold Steel 3 was announced as a PS4 exclusive. But that didn't last long now, did it? Not only is it also on PC, but it has just released on the Nintendo Switch for handheld console players to enjoy. Here is my review of The Legend of Heroes: Trails of Cold Steel 3 for the Nintendo Switch. I'm going to be as spoiler-free as I can as we go into the story section, but just in case you want to avoid all story spoilers, please skip to the 2-minute and 55-second timestamp. Cold Steel 3 takes place about a year and a half to 2 years after the events of Cold Steel 2. Protagonist Rean Schwarzer is now an instructor at the Thor's Military Academy's new branch campus, bringing us back to the more school-like setting of the first Cold Steel game. But as he's instructing and training a new Class 7, a certain organization comes back into the light, throwing Rean and his friends, both new and old, right back into the big conflict. Now, the way the story progresses is very similar to how Cold Steel 1 did, and there are many situations where Rean himself doesn't feel like that much of an instructor, but more of a companion or guide type character for all of these new students. And being the third entry of the Cold Steel series, it's pretty obvious that you're expected to be familiar with the first two Cold Steel games, as the events of those two games are referenced quite a lot in the story without a whole lot of explanation. Not to mention the huge amount of references to the Trails in the Sky games, from little pieces of context and dialogue to many of the characters actually showing up and taking part in the story. Thankfully, there is a pretty extensive recap section of the main menu to catch you up on the events of Cold Steel 1 and 2, but at the end of the day, you'll actually know and appreciate this game the most if you go to other systems like the PlayStation Vita, PS4, or PC and play those previous games first. When it comes to gameplay, this is a turn-based RPG just like its predecessors. As you dive through the game, you'll be navigating through a lot of story scenes as well as exploring city hubs and dungeons where you'll take part in turn-based battles. Now, as I said in the previous section, the game flow of Cold Steel 3 harkens back to the school setting of Cold Steel 1. Each chapter has a school segment with a lot of story and classes, along with dungeon and mock battle segments before you actually go out into the world. And then for the other 2/3 of the chapter, you'll actually go out into a specific location of the world and have a new kind of town or city hub with dungeons around it as you perform quests and go through the rest of the chapter's story. This will definitely be very nostalgic for fans of the series, but I do have to point out that while you do have a lot of different things you can do, it gets repetitive very quickly. What you're doing in each chapter isn't the part that gets repetitive, it's just the fact that every single chapter feels like it's the same events, just in a different location with different characters involved. I can't really get into the specifics because of spoilers, but once I hit chapter 2 and started going into the major battles, I basically knew exactly what was going to happen. I just didn't know what new context we'd be getting and what characters would be involved this time. But when you do get into these gameplay heavy segments, you've got a lot of dungeons that you can explore both on foot and with vehicles like horses and motorcycles. And you've got very similar turn-based combat to what we had in the first two games. You've got a party of characters against a party of enemies and can do a lot of different commands. You can also equip special quartz items to be able to get special buffs and new abilities. But this is all returning stuff. As far as new combat features, one of the new characters can switch modes between being a melee attacker and a ranged firearms attacker. You can also give your party orders for various different effects. But at the end of the day, even with these enhancements and the UI changes, it'll still feel like the same combat system that people are used to. And speaking of things we're used to, so is the amount of content and context here. The Legend of Heroes has always been extremely heavy on both story and gameplay content, and Cold Steel 3 is no different. While the story scenes easily take up at least half of this time, you'll probably be spending no less than about 50 to 60 hours from start to finish. And now let's get into presentation. Graphically, the game looks pretty good. It's definitely a step up from the previous handheld entries, looking a lot smoother and less blurry than the PlayStation Vita games. Though oddly enough, the character head renders that they use for story cutscenes look oddly jaggy compared to the much smoother in-game graphics. As far as the frame rate is concerned, it's a nice smooth 30 frames per second, and even the cinematic areas that had a lot of frame drops on the PlayStation Vita look nice and smooth on the Switch. Though there is one problem I ran into when it came to presentation. A couple segments of the game, specifically in chapters 2 and 3, there were areas where you would start to get a loading screen in the middle of city hubs, and it would be an infinite loading screen. The only way I got around these was reloading a previous save file and trying that same area again. That's the only problem I had with performance, so now let's get into battery life. On the original model, Trails of Cold Steel 3 has a battery range of 3 hours and 3 minutes up to 4 hours and 5 minutes. On the Nintendo Switch Lite, it has a range of 3 hours and 18 minutes up to 5 hours and 23 minutes. And on the V2 or Redbox 2019 model, it has a range of 5 hours and 3 minutes up to 6 hours and 53 minutes. In conclusion, Trails of Cold Steel 3 brings the niche series back to handhelds for fans of the first two games on the PlayStation Vita. Now on the downside, the story flow and game progression gets a bit too repetitive and predictable in how events play out in each chapter, and there are some bugs with the loading sequences and jaggy dialogue models. But if you make sure to save often and enjoyed the Cold Steel 1 style of game flow, it's still a very good RPG with tons of references to the other Trails games. Reviews to Go rates The Legend of Heroes Trails of Cold Steel 3 for the Nintendo Switch an 8 out of 10. If you have any comments or questions, feel free to leave them below. Thanks for watching and have a great day.